Hey there YouTube family, welcome back to a brand new hour-long painting lesson. Today we are going to be painting another wildlife scene, and that is going to be this elephant out in the forest. We'll have some light rays, we'll have some really beautiful greens, and I think we'll create quite a tranquil piece. So with that, before we really get into it, I would like to take care of a little bit of housekeeping, starting with the fact that my cat Howie just released his second vlog, so I'd recommend going and checking that out. It is about his true love of cereal, and it's pretty funny. So there's a link to that in the description. Another little update is that if you are a member over on Patreon at the Alpine level, I actually just added 4 of my ebooks up to that level, so you can go and just download those right now. There is Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. In it we talk about how to create depth, how to blend your paint, how to use water, what brushes to use, how to make three-dimensional subjects, really everything under the acrylic painting sun. There are also both of my painting prompts books, which are essentially 21 traceables for days where you really want to paint, you want to make something, but you don't really know what to paint or what to create. It's easy, you just pick one of those, transfer it to canvas, kind of skip over that drawing process and get right into it. So all of that has just been added up over on Patreon. I do recommend going and checking it out if you are a member, and if you are a member, thank you for making these lessons happen. These videos would not happen without you. So with that, let's quickly talk about the materials and then we'll get into the painting lesson. So as per usual, we are going to be using the 9 by 12 inch canvas. The drawing is already done on here. It was done with these woodless colored pencils. I like these a lot because they allow me to allocate different colors to different subjects. So here you can see the grid is done in a red, the trees are in a brown, the foliage is in a green, and it just helps me kind of keep everything organized. Of course, if you'd like help with the drawing process, I do have the traceable and the reference photo up over on Patreon just to kind of help make that easy. And of course, if you are new and unaware, Patreon is a great way to support the channel, to say thank you. It's also a great way to get plenty of extra bonus perks and rewards. Up there, I have over 50 bonus episodes. You can get instant access to our exclusive Facebook group where we all kind of share our work, help each other out. It's a great place to get a little critique. I also do personalized video critiques, and now I also have all 5 of my ebooks up over there as well for download. We also do polls and things to decide on future lessons, and it's just a great way to be a part of the community and to support the community as well. With that said, back to materials here. I have a small dish of water. This is just to keep my brushes clean, to take off excess paint, and to keep my brushes damp as well, but we'll talk about that more in the lesson. Here I have a painting cloth to wipe off the excess paint. Here I have my palette, and I think the colors that we're going to be using here today. We may add a couple along the way, but I will list all of them in the description, that way you know exactly what we're using before we actually start the painting. So here I have a titanium white, this is a cadmium yellow deep hue, this is a burnt sienna, this is a cerulean blue, and over here we have a Mars black. I like cerulean blue because it leans a little bit more towards green than a general blue, and that'll pair really well with this warmer yellow. Here, this burnt sienna is essentially a brown with a little bit of red in it, and I like that just because it feels a little bit more warm and lively. And in a scene where we have lots of light rays, I think it'll all work really well together. We'll talk about our color combinations in the lesson though. So from there, let's talk brushes. Here I have my larger flat-headed brush. This one has a 2 centimeter top, and it's great for working in large areas and creating sharp lines. Then I have my medium-sized flat-headed brush. This one is only 1 centimeter wide, but it's also great for those details and can deliver a good amount of pigment. Then I have a second one of those, and what I'm going to do with this, I'm just going to peel back the bristles and make it very disheveled. That way it kind of has bristles that leaf off in all directions. And I'm making this so that I can kind of tap on lots of little impressions that are kind of forever changing and making a really interesting painting. We'll talk about that again when we get into the background of the lesson. Then I have a smaller flat-headed brush, so this one is only 0.5 centimeter wide, and it's great for the really detailed areas. Then we move into a new type of brush, the round-headed brush, and this, as you can see, has a very soft edge, no hard lines. It's great for really smooth blends, and then I have a smaller version of it as well for the really detailed, smaller blends. So those are the brushes I'm using, those are the paints I'm using. The majority of the brushes are Artist Loft. The majority of the paints are Liquitex Basics or Winsor & Newton. I like them, and I also like using them together. So that is our materials for this lesson. So with that said, let's jump into it and have some fun. I'm going to begin here today by taking our largest flat-headed brush. Again, this one is 2 centimeters wide, and I'm going to dip the tip of it in some water and wipe off the excess along my bowl. And I'm doing this to kind of condense the bristles. They condense when they're wet. This will also add some additional wet life to my paint and help me blend with it for a longer period of time. So now let's start on the background. I like to work on the backgrounds because it's a big area, it's a good place to warm up, to practice, and because it's easy to layer all of our foreground subjects on top of it. Now, for a background, we need a green because it is essentially a forest. So how do we make that with our palette? We essentially take a good amount of our cadmium yellow deep hue. I'll take some cerulean blue, and I'm trying to grab predominantly with the corner of my brush, that way I don't dilute the other pigment too much in the process. And I'll start blending those two out well here on my palette. And this is a really nice green. I like it. It kind of leans towards a blue, but it's also a little bit warm. It's this great combination. And before we apply it, I need to establish a little bit of value in it. Here we have our hue, it's our color. Now let's add a value so we can better establish depth. Generally, when things are farther away in the background of our paintings, they have a lot of atmospheric and reflective light, and it tones down the values. So you don't have stark bright colors or stark dark pigments either. It's more of a middle ground, and as you get closer to the foreground, you get to see the innate coloring and the innate contrast of subjects, and therefore you get to see the darker darks and the lighter lights. So we need something more neutral for the background. So I'll take a hint of Mars Black, I'll apply that in there, and then I'll take about double that in titanium white. And I'm taking about double that in titanium white because I want about an even mixture of gray, and Mars Black is a significantly stronger pigment than titanium white. And here you can see I'm really toning it down. It's much more neutral, still relatively dark, which is nice for the background. It'll allow our foreground to stand out as well as our light rays. So now I'm going to take this and I'm just going to start applying it around my elephant in the background. And I'm using the sharp edge of this brush, as you can see, to deliver a very clean line. And then once I have those lines, I'll kind of work my way back up. I have some drawings in here, and I'll avoid them for the most part, but if I go over them, I'm not concerned. I can always go back to the traceable, redraw them, do one of many things. But here you can see I'm just spreading out that paint, creating this very nice green background. Now I had a lot of paint on my brush, so I'm able to get quite far with it. But as soon as it starts to get a little bit toothy, once you can see that canvas showing through, go back to your palette and grab some additional paint. You really don't want to be creating thin layers in this process. So here I'm working around my branches. I'm going over little parts of them, but I'm leaving enough that I know essentially where it's going to be. So I'm just trying to give myself as much information as I can for the future. I'm going to occasionally dip my brush back in my water to make sure that things remain nice and smooth. The water will thin our paint to a point and allow us to get these really small impressions that I'm getting right here. Those really sharp lines. But it also thins the paint to a point, and we don't want to thin it too much. So it's all about finding that right balance. Here I have a good amount of paint down here, so I'm just kind of picking that up, moving it about. I don't have to worry about that kind of getting too thin. And I'm starting to run out of paint, so we'll mix up some more. Take some blue, some yellow, mix those two. And I like to mix my paint on top of my previous mixture, that way I know that I'm getting something very similar. There we go. Now we need some white and some black. Mix those together. And that looks very close to our initial mixture. We'll try it. It's a little bit brighter, so I'll get a little bit more Mars Black, mix that in, give that a go, and that's much better. It's okay if it's a little bit different. We can do multiple layers here in the forest, make it even more interesting, and we're going to have light rays over a lot of this area anyway. So I'm just kind of painting in a background. And if I leave in a couple little brush strokes here and there, that's also okay. It'll just look like foliage, clusters of foliage, texture, all of these great things. There we go. Working around my branches again. I like to work around the edges of branches while I still have a good amount of paint and while my brush is still relatively damp, because it'll give me the most control. There we go. And I think we'll cover the majority of this piece of foliage. Come back in and paint it a little bit later. Just going to leave the middle, that way I have a rough estimate of where it was. And I'll do the same with another one down here. Again, starting on the edges and then working my way into that middle area. This is great. Going over really well. Now I'm going to move over to the left-hand side of my painting, and yet again I need some more paint. So here we go. And I'm continuously remixing my paint, getting more and more, because every time I mix it, I get a little bit better at articulating color, at mixing color, at matching color. If we only did it once, we probably wouldn't retain it. And by going back and doing this 3 or 4 times, it sticks in our head. That way we can reintroduce these ideas, these color mixes into future paintings. So I have a good amount of paint right there. Generally start on the edges. Went over a bit of my tree there, but it's okay, I left this area. You want your branches to progressively get smaller as they work their way up, rather than larger. So make sure that you taper them in a little bit. And it's also good to have your trees and branches overlapping one another. Makes it feel three-dimensional. And will make the piece feel much more dynamic. There we go. As I get towards the edges, I'm going to incorporate a little bit more Mars Black, because there's going to be less light working its way through the trees on the edges. You can see it's now this really nice dark rich green. Again, not worrying too much about my edges or details, just trying to keep the main idea of everything. And then I might also incorporate some of this back into that middle area and just make sure there's a subtle transition. And again, I'm not aiming for the most perfect of blends in any of this. I'm okay with a little bit of brush stroke showing through. It will add needed character to the piece. There we are. You can tell it got a little bit brighter over here, and that's just because the pigment was getting thin, and you can see the canvas through thin pigment, and the canvas is quite bright. So if you ever feel like your pigment's getting brighter in an area, it might be because you simply don't have enough paint on that area. And you might just need to do a little bit more layering. There we go. It's a good start. Now I'm going to clean off my brush. As you can see, wiping it back and forth. I'm done with it for now. We will go back to it. Oh, you know what? I say I'm done with it for now. I kind of want to fill in that area as well. We should do that. So I'll make a little bit of a brighter green again. And that means I'll just add some blue, yellow, and a little bit of white. It'll probably bring us back to what we had initially, and that's quite close. So now I'll work my way around my elephant as we did before, using the corner of my brush for the really detailed areas, though you could switch to the medium-sized or smaller flat-headed brush instead. There we go. It's a slightly different green, but that's actually kind of nice. It's just instigating this extra level of diversity in the painting. There we go. Can take some of that green and work it into other areas as well, just to make it nice and cohesive. Just like that. So now we have a background. It has a lot of different greens. It has slightly darker edges, which create a slight vignette, which bring the eye into the center. So we have a lot going on in a very simple application. Now I'm going to switch to the medium-sized flat-headed brush that I kind of disrupted by pulling out all of these bristles. And I'm going to create foliage, or the implication of foliage, in the background with it. So let's say this is our dark background. We want some light hitting some foliage. You know what, I'll mix the paint with this. Take some titanium white and move it into the green that we previously had, and interject some extra cadmium yellow deep hue. And we'll just create a slightly brighter, slightly warmer mixture here. I need to reincorporate the white to make it brighter, and I need to reincorporate the yellow to give it more saturation, because every time we add white to a pigment, we desaturate it a little bit. So I think this will be a nice pigment, and we can test it up here. That'll be quite good. And this is essentially to have some highlight on our leaves that are kind of protruding and catching a little bit more light. Now I mixed it all with this brush rather than this one, because if we mixed with this brush, it would have condensed the bristles, and that's not what we want. So now that I have my pigment, I can apply my brush to it, try to get it on the ends of the bristles, and then I can go and I can make a tap, and it creates all of these little applications. But what you can also do is a tap and a little bit of a drag, and it creates these really neat clusters of implications that look like leaves. Because as you do the drag, you kind of create this little stroke that is larger in some areas, smaller in others, and it just presents itself as a piece of foliage would. I'm rotating my brush in the air to give myself consistently a different application, as you can see. And as I do this, the more I tap, the more it runs out. So then I can get these really subtle little applications for areas that are a bit farther away that aren't going to be catching as much light. This tree, it's more in the foreground, so it's catching much more light, it's much more noticeable. And then as I start to work my way back or down, I start to run out of paint, and those implications are less noticeable, though you still get that texture and that nice look. There we go. Let's add some over here. And I'm being very loose with it. Still doing a slight drag, still rotating in the air. We'll add a more subtle version over here. and then I'll drag it out. That way, by the time I get here, all I get are these very small impressions you can almost only see in person, but you still have that texture, right? Now let's mix up a little bit more of an even slightly brighter highlight. So I'll add a little bit more yellow and a little bit more white. Blend that out. I'll keep my brush with that pigment on it just because I think we'll be back to it quite quickly. I'll grab some of that, and now I can add some extra highlight and build some extra depth onto this foliage. You see, depth is created in painting by wrapping light around subjects. So if the light's coming down from here, the foliage is going to be a little bit brighter, but then the top of the foliage is going to be even brighter. So I'm just trying to brighten it up a hint more and create something interesting. Now, when we get really far into the background here, like in the bushes, I'm applying it and I'm doing a slight blend so that I'm kind of just moving the brush around a little bit, and I might come back to it and move it around a little bit more. And this is going to give me a slightly softer look to all of it. It's not going to have those hard edges like that does, and it makes it look like it's a little bit farther away, like it's not fully in focus. There we go. And we can even do this with some of the darker pigment that I still have on the edge. And I'm kind of bouncing around with it. There we have a couple little highlights standing out. It's kind of nice. Can soften them though, so they're a little bit farther away, just going back and forth over them. Like so. You can grab a hint of the white with the brush and move it in, and a hint of the yellow, but you really don't want to do more than that, otherwise it will start to condense the bristles. And here you can see some real highlights on just a couple of the trees. I don't want it on many. Just trying to create some variety and make things feel original and natural. There we go. Grab a little bit more. Of course, it's blending with the green underneath, so we're not getting a pure bright yellow. Can add some hints of it down here, just to build a little bit of extra depth. And over here as well. Remember to rotate your brush in the air, that way your applications do change, make something different and interesting. I'm just moving it out. There we go. It really stands out nicely over there because it's a bit darker, where it blends a little bit more over here. When you're painting and you want something to stand out, generally it's not about making everything really bright. It's about making a lot of contrast, having one dark area, one light area, and working that way. Now, should you add too much highlight, as I feel like I've started to do on both sides, you can take a hint of Mars Black, work that into your mixture, grab a little bit more blue, grab a little bit more yellow, just go back to a bit of a darker blend, and you can take this technique and reincorporate it. That said, I wouldn't do it just over those single areas that didn't work out the way you wanted. Start working it into other areas of the painting. Those values, those other colors, will just help diversify it and make it a little more interesting throughout. I'm also adding this more towards the bottoms of trees and bushes and that sort of thing because it's a little bit cooler. It has blue and less yellow. So it works really well to kind of cast a bit of a cold shadow. There we go. Now, that's working really, really well. And we want to put our light rays in, but I think we'll do that once we've incorporated our trees. So before we move on to that, let's continue moving a little bit forward in the painting, and we'll do so with the larger square-headed brush, and we'll just create more of this greenery, but we'll make it with a slightly higher contrast. So we'll make it a little bit darker in the base layer, and we'll make the highlight layer a little bit brighter. So here I'm starting with Mars Black, I'm grabbing my yellow, my blue, and I'm only going to grab about an equal amount of white to the Mars Black I used, where initially I used double the titanium white. And this, as you can see, is making a bit of a darker green and a nice base layer. I might add a hint more Mars Black. Now I'll apply this like so. Just create my next layer of bushes. It's a little bit closer to us. And as you can tell, it's actually relatively close value-wise to what we have in the background, so I'll adjust it. I'll make it a little bit darker, specifically around the bottom. And this will make it pop more and feel like it's really a part of our foreground. There we go. Even without the detail, it already feels front and center. So I'm just loosely applying this at this point. I'm not worrying about edges or detail or any of that. I'm just getting the paint on there. And it's going to remain wet for some time because we are mixing with our water. So I'm not worried about it drying either. Now I'm going to switch over to my smaller flat-headed brush. And you know what? I say that we should really clean this before we continue. We don't want that paint hardening on our bristles. When we clean this brush though, it's going to condense our bristles a little bit, and it's going to keep them condensed in the time that it's wet and damp. So we're essentially taking this brush out of commission for 20 to 30 minutes when we do this, unless we really want to dry it well ourselves. But that's okay, it's better than letting the paint dry on the ends of the bristles and having a useless brush. So I do that and then I wipe off the excess paint quite well. Now I'm heading back to my smaller flat-headed brush. I'll grab some more of this pigment and I'll just create some subtle little individual leaves here, kind of flying off of our bushes that we have here in the foreground. And that's why we weren't worried about the edges, because we were going to come back in and create them manually with this brush. So before, we were able to create hundreds of them very quickly with just this tapping effect because they were farther away, they're smaller, you don't see the detail on the sides. But when you get more into the foreground, like we have, we start to really get an opportunity to build a little bit more realism into it and create actual shape and form that we recognize as more of a leaf up close. So there I just mixed a little bit more paint, coming back in, creating these little movements, and I mixed a slightly different color. It's a little bit brighter, so I'm going to move it in just a little bit. That way we have a consistency, that way it's cohesive. It'll also make it look like a little bit of light is working its way into these bushes. But I'm not just moving in one direction. Predominantly on this side, I'm making the leaves go this way. That way it acts as a leading line and draws the eye towards the elephant. But over here, I'm moving that way, again, to do the same thing. And I'm also doing random strokes kind of down here and moving them that way, that way, that way. That way it's continuously interesting and changing. If you did want to spend, say, 6 to 10 hours on this though, I probably wouldn't do things randomly. I'd think about each individual application and making it nice and sharp. But under time constraints, you can be a little bit more loose with it. And some people find painting loose better. Sometimes people find painting a little bit more structured better. So just figure out what's right for you, what you enjoy, and then go from there. Now that's a great base layer for it, though I think we can add some highlights to it now. So I'll take some of my cadmium yellow deep hue, some titanium white, I'll mix that into our green that we have here. We have a lot of Mars black, so when we tried to brighten it with the titanium white, it kind of lost the green and it became a gray. So now I'm just reintroducing my color to that mixture, as you can see. And we can come back in and just do lots of little strokes here around the top predominantly to create this highlight. It's a pretty cool highlight. It has a lot of blue in it, so I'm going to use this predominantly around the edges where the sun rays aren't going to be hitting. That's where we can use our more cold looking greens. There we go. Incorporate some over here. Again, I'm being fairly loose. If you want to really loosen up your stroke, hold your brush a bit farther back. It'll add a bit of extra inconsistency. It'll allow you to move a little bit more as you make that stroke. A lot of us innately paint holding our brush like this, like a pencil, and that's because that's how we learned to draw. And it's a great technique for creating really finite detail, but if you want motion in your painting, if you want it to be more dynamic, if you want it to feel a little bit less stiff, holding the brush a bit farther back is a great way of doing so. I tend to do both in my paintings. But it's all about finding out what you're comfortable with. Now I'm going to create a bit of a warmer green for some additional highlights more close to the center where the light's going to be shining in from. And there you can see just how warm that yellow is in comparison to the previous highlights we just created. So here I'm still just creating these very minor small taps, creating little drags in my brush stroke, creating this foliage and bouncing it in and around the cool applications that we have here in the middle area. And I'm not really going to stray over to the edges, just going to keep it on the right and left of our elephant. There we go. If you make things a little bit too prominent, again, don't worry, you can always go back in and darken it again. Just work back and forth until you get what you like. There we go. Quite nice. That right there turned out a little bit too bright, so I am just going to grab some of that darker pigment that I still have on the edge here of my greens, and I'll reintroduce that. You can see it became quickly, significantly more subtle. So from there, we've done quite a bit in our painting, and it can be very easy to kind of zero in on a singular area, really assess the detail, the value, the saturation, all of it. But when you do that, you can kind of lose context with the larger painting. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a couple steps back, view it as a whole rather than as an individual piece. And I know that sounds crazy because can't you just look up? Yes, you can, but it's much easier to really see how all of your values and hues are working together by taking some steps back. If you don't have a lot of room in your studio, an easy way of getting around this is just by holding up a mirror or by taking a picture on your phone and looking at that, because it'll condense the image, it'll make it smaller, it'll probably flip it, and it'll give you a much more realistic rendering of the painting, which is crazy, right? Because we're looking at it, what could be more real than the thing in front of us? Something that isn't visually distorted by our eyes over time, and that is, again, the mirror or the picture. So let's take a little break, do that, and then we'll jump right back in. After stepping back, I'm feeling really good about this. I like how we have the smaller implications here and here. I like how we have the larger leaves here and here. I like the variety of greens, the darker edges. I feel like it's progressing quite well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to take a little break from my greens, and I'm going to work with some browns, both in the ground and on the trees. Then we can continue progressing. And I'm doing this because generally I like to layer background to foreground, and we need to layer the foreground foliage on top of the ground, and I'd also like to layer a little bit of foliage on top of our trees, both at the bottom and on the top. So I'm going to do that first, just because it makes sense in working forward. Now for this next step, I'm going to take my larger flat-headed brush. I was debating between the medium-sized and the larger one, and Howie is nudging the camera tripod. It's very cute, and I apologize if it moves a little bit. But with that, I'm going to take some of my burnt sienna that we have right here, move that over to a clean spot on our palette. I'm going to take a hint of my cerulean blue to cool it down a little bit. Took maybe a little bit too much there, so I'll grab some more burnt sienna. It's all about trial and error, finding what works for you. Then I'll grab a hint of Mars Black. We don't need much because it's already such a dark mixture. And I'll add a hint of titanium white as well. And this will give us a nice grayish brown with some cool hints, but also kind of a reddy base. And I'll take this, and we'll just test it down here because it's a large area to test and to see how it works in conjunction with our other colors. And I actually like that a lot. So now I will take some of it, and I will start working it into my trees. Now I grabbed a fair bit of water before I began this, that way I could create these very sharp edges. But in the process, as you can see, when I apply this, it's very thin. And that is just because the water is making it so, which is okay. It's something we recognize when we work with acrylics and water. It just means we might need to go back and do a couple extra applications or layers. Here I'm using the corner of my brush, just the corner, and I'm using it like a pencil. You can see I'm holding it like a pencil, and I'm just trying to create these very fine, sharp impressions. Here I'm using the edge to create a bit of a longer one. Here I use the edge again, but you don't want to keep just using the edge because it'll create the same sized shape every time, and you want more diversity than that. So here you can see I'm going back to the corner, and I'm just filling all of this in. Just like so. For the smaller tree in the back, you really could use the smaller flat-headed brush. The smaller the brush you use, the more control you have, but the longer it will take. Again, I do want these lessons to be around an hour. I recognize that this will probably be closer to 2. But because of those time constraints, I'm working with a slightly larger brush than I normally would if I felt I had more time. So just something to consider. Here I'm playing with a bit of a lighter brown, which I figured we could try here. And this will act as the light hitting the side of the tree. The light's coming down this way, right? Which means that the right-hand side of the tree is going to be receiving light and therefore having a highlight. And this is how we create depth in our tree. We just add a little bit of light on one side, we wrap it around the middle, we allow it to dissipate around the back and the other side, and in that process, we render something that looks three-dimensional. Because it's existing in the world, it's reacting to the light source. There we go. It can be difficult on these smaller branches, and eventually you kind of need to concede and just go with a single value if you're working on a canvas a similar size to mine, and that's okay. Here I'm kind of getting a middle gray, not too bright, not too dark. Say gray. It's more of a gray-brown still. And I'm just going to create some extra little branches that come out Again, we want them to overlap one another. I want some of them to get lost in foliage. Here we'll put one that kind of moves backwards. That way it can crisscross with some other branches. Using the corner. There we go. Here I have another one. So I'll just kind of start that. Now, as I started at the bottom, I had this really nice clean stroke, and as I got up here, I started to lose pigment, so I pressed a little bit harder with my brush. And what happens in that scenario is the bristles expand, and now I have a smaller base, a larger medium area, and then a larger top. And that's the opposite of what we want. We want it to taper as it moves upwards. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take that paint off my brush, I'm going to add some water, I'm going to go back, grab some new paint, I'm going to make the bottom a little bit wider, and I'm going to be more delicate when I get up here. Now this looks like it could be a larger branch. Perhaps it's coming in from this tree over here, which we will make larger. There we go. This is quite rough. You can see that it's barely covering the green and the canvas. That's because it is quite thin. That is okay. It's just my first layer. Just kind of plotting it in, making sure I know where I want it. Then we can come back in, add some highlights to these trees. Looks quite nice. Really like the red the burnt sienna provides. Go back, make our darker mixture again. Create some more base layers. There we go. That's really nice. You don't want the value to be too different from the rest of the surrounding area. Predominantly, though, the bottom of the painting. Because the bottom essentially marks where it is in space, and the top will have a similar amount of light. The bottom will probably have less because it'll have more shadows on it, but you want it to have a similar value here. It's debatably a little bit too dark, so I might go back over that with a slightly lighter value. This one's pretty perfect, this one's pretty perfect, this one's pretty perfect. So think about it honestly, give it a critical eye, and just adjust as you need to. It's okay to paint over something 3, 4, 5 times. It's how the best paintings, it's how the best painters are made. Going back, whipping up some more of my highlight. And I'm going to do a little bit of a tap for this tree in the foreground because I want to create some texture in it. I want to give it some personality. As the trees get closer, they will appear larger. And as they appear larger, you get to see more detail and texture in them. Just like the foliage and the leaves. There we go. I'll have a little bit less there at the bottom just because you will get less and less light hitting that area. I'll take a little bit of that highlight, work it slightly into the background. Trees, again, we don't want as much because they are a little bit farther away, so they won't have that same level of detail, but they will still get a little bit of it. Here I'm just working some extra branches out, making it a little more interesting. This tree right here is quite close to the light, so I'm giving it some extra light. There we go. Now you saw I made a large stroke right there. That was because I ran out of paint, I pressed harder, and I made a mistake. Now when you do that, provided the background layer is dry, you can take another brush, like this smaller flat-headed brush, make sure that it is very clean. You can come back up, just add a lot of water, and just kind of scrape off that paint. So just like that, we fixed it, but something to consider, again, don't get lazy, don't just start pressing harder with your brush as you start to run out. Go back and grab more paint, otherwise you will cause more problems and it will take more time. Here, now I am going back, I'm just adding some extra little bright branches. It's okay to have some brighter branches and some darker branches. Just shows diversity and that different amounts of light are hitting different areas. Perhaps some of the smaller branches are moving out to an area that provides more light. There we go. It's a very cathartic process. One of those things I honestly could spend hours playing with, should I not have a time constraint. There we are. The more branches you do, the more natural it'll look, the more interesting it will look. So feel more than welcome to spend more time doing more of them than I am here. Just going to add a little bit more of a highlight to this tree, a little bit to that one, a little bit to this one. There we go. And it's also important to note that most trees don't move straight upwards. This one kind of bends this way, this one kind of bends this way, and then back that way. This one has kind of a bend that moves this way, and then this way. This one has a lot of little movements in it, and that'll just make them significantly more interesting. Now, right here, I believe I had another tree. So, you know, we'll play with that. By the way, don't you worry if you're using the traceable. It has the finished image, not the original, so you don't have to kind of figure this out with me. Your version will be correct from the beginning. So let's just kind of split this tree into two. Or we can have kind of a broken tree, which could be fun. Let's do that. Just putting down my base layer. This will be a little bit more detailed, so I'll switch over to my smaller flat-headed brush. Again, this one is only 1/2 centimeter. Grab some Mars Black, mix up a nice dark mixture, and then I'll paint in the back of this / the opening in it. I'm going to take a couple of steps back, just make sure it's working out well, and then I'll be right back. So after stepping back, I realized I do definitively like how this is going, so I'm going to proceed. And I'm going to take some of our burnt sienna, some titanium white, mix up a bit of that brighter mixture that we used along the sides of our trees, and then I'll work it along the side of this now broken tree. It'll run behind this one. There we go. It's a little bit more saturated, a little bit more red. We can tone it down by just mixing a little bit more Mars Black into that mixture, like so. Add some extra titanium white to the highlights. That will brighten it, but it will also mute that hue as well. There we are. And then it'll get lost down here in the rest of the foliage. I actually do love that red though, so I think I'm going to take a little bit more of it and just work some slight highlights into the rest of our trees. Build a little bit more saturation. Make it nice and fun. There we go. Quite good. So from there, let's continue and work over on this side. So I'll go back to my larger flat-headed brush, because we are working in a large area. Take a lot of that pigment. Remember, our base layer needs to be darker, so I'm grabbing more Mars Black. I'm grabbing a hint of Titanium White. I want to make sure that I have a good amount of that burnt sienna. And I'll start on the edges of my branches, because that's when I have the most paint and I can create the smoothest of applications. There we go. Now once I start to run out of paint, I just kind of move into the middle and start blending things together. Grab some more. Here, working along the edges. Come back, work around the edges. And you can see that this is quite thin. There's a lot of water in my mixture right now, which is helping, but it means that I will have to go over this again. There we go. You can see the difference in value between here and here. It's the same pigment. It's really like a very, very similar mixture. It's just that one has a canvas showing through, so it looks a lot brighter. Here I have less water. I like to start by making my trees as small as I can in the beginning, and then as I need to, I make them slightly larger. It's much easier to make something larger than it is to make it smaller, because if you're making it larger, you're just applying more paint to the edges. If you're making it smaller, you're going back and you're covering edges with the green and the foliage that you've used in the past, so you have to remix all of those pigments. So I generally like to work small to begin with and then scale appropriately. There we go. It's a really interesting tree. Like that a lot. Now let's add some highlights to the edge, some titanium white, some burnt sienna. Do you ever have 5 or 6 thoughts at once, and then when you go to speak, they kind of all occur? That just happened. Hopefully it just adds to, makes it a little bit more entertaining. Not only are we learning to paint, we're learning to decipher. What did he just say? Who knows? Who knows? But anyways, here you can see I'm adding on this highlight to the edge. I'm doing these taps. I'm doing slight blends occasionally. But I'm just building all of this texture and this warm reddish highlight. I like this a lot. There we go. Of course, we'll need some smaller branches. So I'll just take some of that darker mixture again and start working these off in varying directions. Accidentally made the top branch there a little bit bigger, so here I'm going back, making the bottom smaller. Or larger to compensate for it, rather. Grab some extra burnt sienna, mix it in with the darker pigment, and I want to go over some of these edges that are a little bit thin again. And just build that up, slowly making it darker, slowly making it more thick. It's not a pure Mars Black, but it's getting closer and closer. And I'm adding it to the right-hand side of the tree this time, because the light's coming in this way, and that means it'll catch the left-hand side of the tree rather than the right-hand side of the tree, like the opposite area of our painting. There we go. Really nice. Just taking some time, leaning back, making sure it's all just kind of progressing the way we want it to. Here we can have a small branch or a couple of them kind of coming out of the bottom as well. There we are. Just building it out until it looks alive. Grabbed a little bit of a brighter pigment there, and it doesn't show up to the same extent, so I'm just now going back, grabbing that darker pigment. We can have some foliage kind of flying off the edge there. And you know, this is inspiring me to just do a little bit more on this side as well. It's okay to jump around, to work back and forth. Don't need to add much, just a little bit. And now we go in for our highlights. Some more burnt sienna, more titanium white. Work that along the edge. Work that along the edge. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but Howie is purring very loud in the background. It's a very relaxed setting now. There we go. Great. So from there, we can move on to the ground area. Should we want to go back and add more highlights, we can, but I'm quite happy with that. To do more of that ground area, though, we need more burnt sienna. We don't have much, and I don't want to kind of stretch it farther than we should, because then, as we know, it just becomes too thin. So there is some extra burnt sienna. Here is the tube that it comes in. It's by Winsor and Newton. Again, big fan of both that brand and Liquitex Basics for acrylic painting. Now we'll grab some of it, move it over here. We'll start with a darker base layer. So more Mars black. There's a hint of titanium white that is mixing in with it right now though. And I'll just apply this to the base here. Work my way roughly around my foliage. Come back and grab some more. As you can tell, it's quite thin. My brush is still fairly wet from cleaning it, and as a result, my pigments are a little bit thin. Here you can see the contrast of my current pigment versus what I initially used when my brush was probably a bit more dry. So to compensate, we'll just add more thick pigment. Burnt sienna's a fairly thin paint, but both titanium white and Mars black are quite thick. So we're using a bit more of those for this base layer, and then should we want to go back in and reincorporate some additional saturation, we can do that. But here you can see just how quickly and easily we are able to deliver very thick pigment now that we are using more of that titanium white and more of that Mars black. Using the edges to sharply work around the legs. There we go. Figuring it all out, spreading it out, using the corner for the really detailed areas. And we'll go back over that thick area and just see how thick our pigment is. Put it to that test. You can tell that this brown and this green almost sink into one another, and that means that the values are very, very similar, which is exactly what we want because it's around a similar space depth-wise in the painting. Now, once we cover this, we can start assigning some depth to it by playing with the value a little bit. There we go. Just going back over it with some larger strokes. That way I get not a subtle blend, but a consistent application over all of the area. Though if you do want to create a very smooth, subtle blend in anything, including the background, use a very soft stroke with your brush. The softer it is, the less paint it will push to the edges, and the more of a clean, very undisruptive stroke you will create. If you want a lot of brush strokes, press extra hard with the brush. Now we have a flat brown here for this base area. The background, we know it's going to be a little bit brighter. We have that light coming in, so how do we do that? We switch to the medium size flat-headed brush because I'm going to be working with a bit more detail here. And then we're going to brighten this slightly. So I'll just add a little bit of titanium white to it. I'll come into the background. I'll apply it, and then I'll start working my way forward. And then as I get a little bit closer, I'm going to start doing this little tap, kind of like we did to the edges of the trees, but this will create some highlight on little mounds of rock and dirt that are kind of protruding. And I'm going to do this up here in the foreground as well, because what this is going to do, it's going to be a little bit of light that's streaming in kind of through some of the foliage and catching this area of ground. So I'm just doing this little tap back and forth. I'm creating texture. I don't want a blend. I want to see little dark pivots and all of these different interesting things happening. Then I can create a slightly darker mixture, as you can see, and I can create even more little divots and whatnot. I'm starting here in the foreground because we're getting farther away from the light. We have less reflected atmospheric light, and we're going to have those darker shadows in the ground. And then I'll move backwards, as you can see in the painting. It'll start to subside, it'll get a little bit less stark, it'll create this very natural progression in depth. We'll even incorporate a little bit there in the background. But this will take out that very soft look we rendered and give it something that's a bit more textured, a bit more tactile, a bit more interesting. And it also kind of took out some of the difference in the value because it did blend to a point with the brighter values. That's okay. We can go back in and reincorporate those highlights by just taking that burnt sienna, that titanium white, like so. And we'll just re-tap on some areas where that light is streaming in. I'll do it in a couple of areas. Started in the foreground because that's where it needs to be the most sharp and vibrant. But then as we move towards the background, it starts to blend more and more with that paint. It gets a little bit more subdued, a bit softer, a bit less saturated, and that's what we want. Because again, most of the detail is seen in the foreground. Most of the saturation is recognizable in the foreground. There we are. That's nice and interesting. I like that. It's diverse, it's different, it's playful, it's cohesive with the trees. It's a lot of good things. We can also take some hints of this really nice highlighted brownish red and just tap it to the edges of this tree as well. It'll make it pop a little bit more. I'll work it into the tree, just a hint. Be this beautiful light touching it. Working it to the top of the branch because of course the light's coming from the top. I applied a little bit too much pressure there and it created a thicker line, so I'm just wiping off that paint and then going back in and working on a slightly smaller, sharper application. There, that's a nice tree. So again, you can just keep adding these highlights and things and improving them. They will just seem more and more natural the more time you put in. And I can take this and even work it back over here. It's kind of addictive. Again, I love painting the edges of these trees. It's arguably, for me at least, the most cathartic part of the painting. There we go. Now we can move on to the next step in our painting, which is the foreground here. We have some bushes, we have some foliage, we have some flowers potentially. We have a lot of option in this area. And we're going to go back to our greens to start it. We're going to start with a darker base layer, so I'm using a lot of Mars black. I'm using a good amount of cadmium yellow deep hue, a little bit of our cerulean blue. I don't want much cerulean blue because the black and the yellow are going to mix to make a green as is. And the blue is just going to make that green look quite blue. So I used a minimal amount. Here I'm applying this, as you can see, loosely, just creating a base layer that we can then build on top of. Trying to do the edges first, doing little taps, using the corner to create the implication of different leaves, foliage, all of that good stuff. And then I'll just work it back in. Kind of cover a bit of my tree there. Work it into the background a little bit. And that is a good start to one of the sides. We'll head over to the other now. Just doing more of the same. But as you can tell, look at that and look at that. What's different? This is brighter. Why is it brighter? Because I'm running out of paint and the water on my brush is taking over. So we will mix up some more paint. Again, a lot of yellow, a hint of blue, a relative amount of black. And just like that, we have our nice pigment again. It's dark, it's thick, it's rich. There we are. And now I'm going to get a little bit more playful, just move it out. Have some different pieces of foliage that are going to be kind of finding their way out of the main clusters. Here I have a couple that I can draw in. Have a little bit kind of poking out here. It could be fun. Now I do want to make these small little pieces that are protruding, that are kind of jumping up. So I'm going to switch back to the smallest flat-headed brush as it'll give me the most opportunity for detail. Just grab more of that pigment. It is slightly damp. holding it like a pencil, that way I get a fairly fine, sharp application. This one will be quite large. Have it overlapping the tree. If you're working with something like this and you want to just try it out but you don't want to commit to it initially, you can work with a very thin, watery effect like I did here. You can still see the tree through it, and if I wanted I could just scrape it off. But it's a good way to kind of test these larger dominant lines that are going to be moving over large portions of the painting. Add another little one over here. Another there. I'm having them move in this way on the left-hand side because, again, it points the eye towards our elephant. I'm having them move more to the left here on this side because it, again, pushes into the elephant. But I'll occasionally throw in a little stray one like that just to make it not so obvious. Subtlety is a good thing. I didn't really love the one I just put on, so what I'll do, I'll add a lot of water to my brush, and I'll just kind of clean that off. Like so. Remember to make them cross, it'll make them much more interesting. There we are. Now let's add a little bit of foliage to them. So we'll take some yellow, take some of that Mars black, hint of titanium white. Remember, we're still just creating the darker base layer. And I'll just tap on some little leaves. I feel like that's a little bit too dark, so I'll add a little bit more yellow and white to our mixture. And that's much better. We can have different little areas that kind of spread out, give us a different selection. Can start to create some out here if you feel like you'll need it to balance what you currently have, and then fill in the body of it after. Being quite playful with this. Again, if I had a lot of time, I'd probably spend more time thinking about each individual piece, how it's kind of moving the eye, doing all of that. But once you've done this for a number of years, you can kind of intuitively do it. And that's what I'm doing. But again, if you're with an excess of time, there's nothing wrong with taking it and utilizing it. Here I'm just moving that middle line back in there, adding some extra foliage, and I'm trying to make sure that it isn't a leaf, a leaf, a leaf, a leaf, back and forth. I'm trying to make them a little bit more uneven to make it a little bit more interesting. There we are. Good. Let's move over to the other side now. Going to mix up a hint more paint. And I can already tell that I want this side to be a bit bigger than how I've already painted it. So I will start expanding very shortly. There we go. It's quite nice. It's a bit more subtle on this side, but I like that because we have the face of the elephant on this side, and I feel like it balances itself out. There we are. Just going back, doing a couple more. I know I'm getting a little quiet through this process. It's just because it's intuitive, it's a little bit more thought intensive, and I'm just trying to make sure that it remains relatively even. With that, I think we did a really good job right there, and I'm quite happy. I'm just going to take a little bit of our darker brown, darken the back of this tree to strengthen the divide between this broken tree and this one. And that worked quite well. Good. Really, really good. The painting is coming along swimmingly. So, with that, before I add highlights and things into the foreground here, before I add the light rays, before I add any extra foliage, before I do any of that, what I really want to do is take a little break, clean my brushes, clean my water. This is an important step in our painting. We don't want our brushes to dry with pigment on them, to become stiff, to become brittle, to be no longer pliable, malleable. Any of those words would have worked. But yeah, I suppose that's also a good sign for a break. With that, we'll clean our water as well. That way we don't keep diluting the pigments we're currently working with. Whenever you're working with an unclean water, you are essentially taking a clean brush, adding a pigment to it via the water, and then mixing that pigment that is on the brush from the water with the pigment you are working with on the palette. And then when you take that, you apply it to the painting, which then mixes it with that paint. So it's a lot of cross-contamination that we don't necessarily need or want. So with that, let's clean our brushes, clean our water, and get right back into a place where we can speak correctly again. See you in a second. So I took a little bit of a break. I cleaned my brushes, I cleaned my water, my painting has essentially dried, and now I'm going to come back in and paint some light that's coming in from the top. And I'm going to paint the light next because I want to add foliage to the trees, but I want to add foliage on top of a lot of this light. So it looks like it's kind of happening in the middle of the painting, and we have trees behind it and in front of it. It'll just create some extra depth. It'll also help me determine how much light I'm putting onto the foreground and how I'm painting the elephant. So, yet again, just like at the start of the painting, I'm starting with my largest flat-headed brush. I'm wiping off my excess water. Then I'm going to head over to my palette, and I have some clean titanium white here, as well as some clean cadmium yellow deep hue, and I have clean pigments because they were diluted. They had little bits of brown and green in them, and I want something very pure. So I'm going to take the titanium white that we have here, I'm going to move it up on my palette to a clean spot. I'm going to grab the smallest hint of yellow here, just with the corner of my brush, give it a hint of warmth. Going to make sure that this area is relatively wet, and then I'm going to come up here, find an area in which I want this to be streaming in from, and then I'm going to move my brush down like that. And we'll have lots of little rays that are kind of coming in at different areas and lengths. So I'll rotate my brush. So here we have a smaller stroke. I'll have another smaller stroke. We can incorporate smaller strokes into the larger ones as well. Maybe we'll have one behind the tree here, and I can actually paint it over the tree and then just go back and take it out. Just like that. You can see, nice and easy. We can also go back and just repaint portions of our tree or our foliage. So we have lots of options. But here you can see I'm just trying to make lots of different impressions. It's all fairly thin because we have a lot of water currently in our brush. Bringing them up. Going to make the top a little bit brighter, just as a whole. There we go. Again, I'm trying to make this much more diverse. We do these light rays in a number of our paintings, but you can do them in so many different ways. There we are. There we go. I'm going to go back over a couple areas and just thicken them. And I've decided to repaint in some of my branches up at the top here just for ease's sake. You can also re-guide the light by just using your finger in a number of these scenarios. The more we go over an area, the brighter we'll get, because the more opaque it will get. And this is just adding some diversity of light. There we go. I'm going to wipe off the excess, kind of softly blend some of them that look a little bit harder, so I'm just going back and forth over them. It also allows me to kind of redefine their edges and their line, which can be useful if they aren't all moving in the direction you want them to be. There we go, just softening that one. Quite a good start there. Now I'm just cleaning off my brush. And from there, I'm going to switch back to the smallest flat-headed brush, grab some of my burnt sienna, some Mars black, hint of titanium white, and now I'll just repaint the branches. I'm starting with a mid to light tone right here. Then I will grab some extra Mars black, some extra burnt sienna, make it a little bit darker, a little bit more rich. Go back over those areas, and again, this will just very quickly give it some extra depth. Because now we have something in front of and behind our light. Just like so. We can also now go in and add some extra foliage and such. So I'll keep this brush. I'll mix up a bit of a darker green, so I'll use some Mars black, some cadmium yellow, a bit of titanium white, and of course a hint of cerulean blue. Make it a little bit darker so it stands out like the middle values of our tree. And then here, I can just tap on all of these little leaves and impressions, just like we did down there. Remember, if you want them to be kind of farther out, you can do that and just incorporate the branch a little bit later. Here I'm covering up portions of my tree, showing that they don't just work around the tree, they work in front of and behind it. And that is a really important thing. You don't just want your foliage to be kind of floating around. You want it to be on top. You want it to be with the tree. It'll make it seem so much more natural. Here we're just working it kind of in the middle of the body there. And now there's some duality in the shape at the top and the bottom of the painting. Just mixing up some more of that pigment. Take it over here. Again, work it over those light rays, over branches. I'm jumping around a lot. And I also like to jump around, that way I don't kind of subconsciously start doing the same thing over and over again. By moving around the painting, you physically have to move your body. It will change the way you apply strokes, your habits, and habits that you don't think you're incorporating or thinking about, just kind of things that have been baked in over years. Which is why I like to move around so much while I paint things like this that are repetitive in nature. We can also fill in areas. So if I have a lot of leaves in one area, I might turn them into a cluster like that, give it kind of a body. And that'll be just something else different, extra. It'll make it look full. That way you can have some sparse branches and you can have some full branches as well. This will be a great place to have some extra foliage. There we are. And remember, this is just the dark layer. We can always go back in and add highlights if you feel like it's getting too dark. It's always a fix. It's a quick detail, but it's one that makes a big difference, as you can see. Here I'm kind of connecting it down to the bottom, giving it a slight vignette effect. I'll add a couple more over here too. There we go. Now we can start adding some highlights. So we're going to make more green this time with more white, more yellow, and a little bit more blue. We'll mix it on top of our previous mixture, that way it does get some of that darker gray in it as well. And that's important just so it remains cohesive with the rest of the painting. So this seems to be quite bright. I can kind of test it in the background there. It is, I think I want it to be a little bit warmer, so slightly more yellow, we'll add slightly more white as well. There we go. And now we'll kind of test this on some of the foliage here at the bottom, areas that, again, can pick up some light. And a lot of this foliage is going to be pushing in that direction one way or another, kind of up or down. So I'm applying my paint and then I'm moving my brush up, down, and making little swirls. I want it to remain fairly dark, and I want it to get darker as we move back here. Can also go up and add some of this to these higher pieces. Give it some depth as well. Don't have to do it to all of them. It's much like trees, where I'd implore you to work sparingly initially, and then just slowly build. Here I have a bit of a brighter area, perhaps it's getting a little bit of light coming in from the top, not necessarily an array, but there's a bit more of an opening there. And I'm just letting my brush run out of paint as I move towards the right and the bottom. So I just get these very subtle implications at this point. There we go. Grab some more, head over to this side. Start with some of these larger, taller pieces. Getting a really nice detailed effect. Now this time, remember, here we moved that way, this time we're moving this way, but we are incorporating the odd one that kind of goes in a different direction, just so it doesn't look too repetitive or obvious. being mindful about how we're applying, where we're applying, the amount we're applying. And now I'm working my way back to the left. I'm allowing that paint to just run out on my brush, creating much more soft strokes at this point. There we go. Create maybe a little cluster out here that does get a little bit more light. But we have a darker area there and around there. And of course these highlights are also needed up here to a point. So we'll just throw this on. This will predominantly be on the tops of our leaves because that's where the light is hitting. Though in some cases the light will move through a leaf if the leaf is a little bit thin, and it will illuminate the entirety of it. So just something to consider. You can have it covering full leaves in areas where you feel it'll be receiving a lot of light. But as you can see, I'm just jumping around. There we go. Now for our next step, I think we will actually start working on the elephant here. And we have this light coming down, it's kind of a cooler painting. I think we'll mix the elephant to begin with a bit of a gray. So I'll take some Mars Black, some Titanium White. We'll start with our darker values. But I'll also add in a hint of blue, just to make it a little bit cooler in the shadows. Now I will kind of look at my reference photo. I have it off to the left-hand side of my painting just to see where I really want to start. And I think the trunk is a good place. It's fairly simple. It's a good place to practice. I'm starting on the edge. The edge is opposite to the light, so this is the darker side. And it works its way up here. There's this little area that protrudes that catches a bit more light, so I'll leave that as is. And then it gets a little bit brighter up here, so I'll stop there. I notice that the bottom of the ear is quite dark, so I will paint that in. And you'll notice that I'm also painting like I'm holding a pencil, just because it's so detailed. There's an area right here that's a bit darker. I'm just kind of filling it in where it seems natural. The left side of this leg is darker, as is the bottom of the foot, and a lot of this really. This is a good area for this pigment. Work our way around the tusk. And up here, I'm working it so far up because the ear and the head and the body will cast a bit of a shadow. The bottom of the body is also quite dark. This is a good way to paint complicated subjects. Isolate certain values, paint all of them at once, and then go in with the next value that you decide important. So here I'm just continuing to paint in all of the darker areas of our elephant. I've gone back, I believe, once at this point to get extra water on my brush. We do want these lines to be nice and clean. There'll just be a little bit of a highlight on the back leg. For the most part, this will be a relatively dark elephant. Here you can see I'm starting to run out of paint, so it's getting brighter, but I can actually use that as a slightly lighter value, which is nifty. Here, it'll be darker. Blend that out. It'll be darker here too. Again, the reference photo is up over on Patreon. So you can check that out if you'd like to kind of do what I'm doing here. Okay, so I think that's good for our first value. Almost. I see a couple areas I say that, and then of course I see a couple areas. That's okay. Just mixing more pigment. Work in the back of this foot here. Now, there are a couple areas like this that I really should go back in and fill in with green and brown, and I will do that. We just kind of missed them in the first pass, and that's okay. Just finding the darkest of dark values. And then we'll go in with the medium to dark values. And work from there. You can tell I'm really taking my time in this process, doing as good of a job as I possibly can. Now I am going to work in the background brown there, just so I don't get it mixed up with anything else. So I'm mixing up a gray-brown, hoping it's similar to what we used. I'll try it out. It looks very similar. And that's why we go back and we remix our paints over and over again, and so we remember in scenarios like this how to do it relatively easily. The back is a bit more white, a bit more desaturated. Just fill that in. Nice and easy. And then I'll move that same stroke, and I might take slight amounts of that pigment and work it into other areas, just so it seems cohesive if it's a little bit off. There we go. Now let's mix a bit of a slightly lighter gray. So I'll just grab a little bit more titanium white, a little bit more. Still mixing a dark gray, it's just not as dark. And I'll try that around the ear. It is a little bit brighter, which is good. Let's make it even brighter for the next step. And that'll be moving into the trunk area. Can blend it a little bit with the darkest application. I will leave the eyes for now. We can go back and work on them in a little bit. At this point, it really doesn't look like much, but that is going to change in just a couple of minutes. Just need to trust the process. There we are. It's okay to work a little bit more quickly through this. You're going to need to do a couple layers, a couple passes to make it as good as you want it. So just kind of getting the paint on there, getting started, not being afraid to work with it is a good thing. As long as you are willing to go back and play with it. So here now I'm starting to add some slightly brighter pigments, as you can see. Blending them a little bit into our darker pigments. And I think I'm actually making this a little bit brighter than it needs to be, but that's okay. It's helping us discern where shapes are in the body, and they can always be darkened very easily. Remember, it's much easier to darken a pigment than it is to brighten it. This area is quite bright up here. Top of the ear will probably also be a little bit brighter. This will be extremely bright, so we'll take a good amount of titanium white, mix that in there. There we go. Starting to come along. Starting to build form, starting to make something three-dimensional. This will be a lot of detailed work right there. So let's finish with the ear for a second. I want to make the bottom a little bit darker. So I will grab some extra Mars black. You can tell it's not as dark as the middle of the ear, but it is darker. Working my way around the edges, being sharp with my applications. And then as I get up there a little bit, it gets brighter again. There we go. This area again is quite bright. There's an area right in here that is quite bright as well. The opposite to this. And again, we'll work our way around the eye. And I'll blend this up. We need it to be kind of a mid-gray in between those top two areas. So I'll just try working that in. And I'll use that mid-gray for here as well. And again, it doesn't look right just yet, but we're definitely getting there. Now at least we have form, we have shape, we have some depth, and now we can really start to play with it and make it something quite good. So I'm going to start by working in some darker values, just to establish a little more contrast, make things more discernible. And the more contrast you have, the more discernible each piece of it is. So I'm going to make the ears a little bit darker here. At the bottom, go back, I will make the trunk a little bit darker as well. Just like so. Just looking back at my reference photo, this area right here is darker. And I think even on the other side of the eye as well. Looking back and forth, taking my time, not trying to rush it. And I'm also recognizing that because I'm working on the canvas that I am, the size that I am, I can only incorporate so much detail, right? So I need to make sacrifices in some areas and make it more simplified. And I'm just trying to figure out where those simplifications can happen and still have a really strong painting. Decided to take a little break from the head there. I'm going to apply some Mars black, a little bit more down here to the bottom, work it up a little bit. Not going to have a lot of light hitting that area. And I think we'll use a bit of a highlighted gray around the ear. That way it's less messy with the darker areas of the body. So I'll just add this highlight that's moving through the edge and the thinnest or the most thin area of the ear. And I can have little pieces that kind of move up like so. Just some light passing through and around. There we go. We'll also get a hint of reflected light over on the other side. So just throw that on. It's all starting to come together. This area is the darkest on the face. So put some extra Mars black in there. It's slowly just refining things. Looking back at the reference, playing with it, figuring out what's working, what isn't. Okay, so I need a bit of a darker line around the eye here. It's going to come up. Then I'm going to have a darker top on the head here. It's going to split these two areas a little bit. It's kind of interesting. It's one of those things I wouldn't have thought about had I not looked directly at the photo. My mind kind of simplified what an elephant's head looks like. And had I just followed my own intuitions, it would have been vastly more simple. That said, you're more than welcome to make your painting vastly more simple. Take artistic liberties. Make your painting the way you want to make it. It doesn't have to follow the rules of reality or a photo or anything really. There we go. Going to tighten up that area around the eye. And we'll go in with a darker black with a hint of white in there. Just using the corner. This eye is kind of getting lost there in the shadow of the face, and that makes sense. Mix up a bit of a lighter gray again. Continue to redefine the top of the head. Again, the area I would not have assumed would look like that. And then also take that really bright value, work it onto the back. This is the light streaming in, hitting the elephant. Just making it as beautiful as it is. There we go. This area is a little bit brighter in the reference photo. This area is a little bit brighter on both sides of the eye. Going to go in and blend that a little bit more. Let's also work on the tusks. For that I'm almost going to use a pure titanium white, but I'm going to grab just a hint of Mars black. This will really clean it up. There we go. Can add a little glimmer of light in the eye. There we go. I feel like I want it to be a little bit darker in the middle again. Just little taps here and there until it works. Wonderful. Really wonderful. Now I'm going to take a couple of steps back after I add just a hint of a shadow to the tusk. I'm going to step back, see how it's looking, and then we'll come back in and make some revisions. So after stepping back, one of the largest revisions I want to make is with the trunk right here. I just want a darker shadow to come down from that area. So I'm just going to grab some extra Mars black, work that into my titanium white, make it a little bit darker to begin with, and then I can slowly build that up. So here now I'll grab a little bit more Mars Black, come in with that, and it's something I'm going to do gradually until it's the way I really want to, but I think it'll make the face shape seem a little bit more natural. We really won't have that much light on the face because the light's coming from behind, right? So we're just looking for little bits here and there, and I also want to use some of my starkest dark values here on the trunk because it's closest to us, it's demanding the most attention, it is the face, that's where we want the attention to be, and therefore we can create the most contrast there and get the most visual effect there. So I'm just adding some extra really dark values into it. I think it already looks a lot more natural. When you're painting a animal this small, in a relatively short amount of time, realism is quite difficult to achieve. So you really just want to get the most out of what strokes you're making. There we go. It's definitely looking better there. Take a little bit more Mars Black, throw that underneath the head and the ear, have it follow down this leg, and have it under here as well. This is going to build some additional depth. And I'm slowly still just bringing it over. There we go. I think that's much better. I'm also going to take a little bit of Mars Black, a little bit of burnt sienna, hint of titanium white, and I do mean the smallest hint. Mix up this very dark, rich pigment, make it very watery, and then I'll create a slight shadow underneath our elephant here. It's quite reflective, the paint right now, because it's so wet, so it's looking a little bit more brown. That's okay. I'll also add a little bit of it in other places, just so we get, again, that very cohesive look. Feet almost get lost in it. There we go. Going to take another step back, see how it's progressing. Now, now we're going to talk to Howie in the background. Yes, Howie, it's almost lunchtime. It's pretty exciting. And I'm going to come back in and I'm going to taper the face in a little bit more. I feel like this side of the face is a little bit wider. And so we're just going to grab some Mars Black, mix that in with our titanium white, and just move that in. It's a very simple process. I'll do so with the ear a little bit as well. There we go. Again, it doesn't need much light on the face. The light's coming from over there. There we go. Now for the next step, what I need to do is let this dry fully. I want to glaze on some extra color, build some extra depth with that, and to do that I need a fully dry canvas. Glazing is essentially when you take a very, very thin pigment, apply it on top of a previously applied dry pigment, and it doesn't change any of the values really, it doesn't change any of the line work or detail, it just adds a little bit of water, a little bit of color on top. And we're going to do so by cleaning our water, cleaning our brushes. We really don't want anything being diluted in this process, because if it is, it'll kind of add some extra color that we don't intend to be there. So I'm going to clean my water, I'm going to clean my brushes, I'm going to let that dry fully, then we'll come back in, we'll add some extra color, and we'll make it a really special piece. Before you get to this point though, make sure that the painting is the way you want, so go in, touch up any leaves you might want, touch up parts of the elephant if you'd like to. This is kind of a final step. It's generally something we do on a lot of the achromatic paintings, but we can also do it on regular paintings as well. So I'm going to take about a 20, maybe 25 minute break, let that dry fully, clean everything, maybe have a little bit of tea and lunch, and then we will be right back. So now we are back. I have some clean water, I have clean brushes, and I have some clean pigments here as well. That way they don't, again, get diluted by other pigments and create colors I don't desire. So I'm going to begin by taking my largest flat-headed brush, going to make sure that the tip of it is wet, as we generally do. Then I'm going to take some of my cadmium yellow deep hue. I'm just going to move that out here on my palette. I'm going to grab the smallest hint of burnt sienna. If I have any extra, I'm just going to tap it off on the palette. And I'm going to mix these together, and it's just going to make a slightly warmer yellow than what I had, and it'll be great for that light that's streaming in. Now I want to paint this over my painting, but still kind of let the detail in it live the way that it is. So I'm going to thin out my paint significantly more by adding more water to my brush, adding more water to my pigment, thinning it to the point where it's more of the consistency of watercolor than anything else. And then I'll take this and I'll just start applying it up here in my painting and dragging it down and about. And the farther you drag it, the more thin it will get. And that isn't a bad thing. You might want it more subtle in some areas than others. But here now you see we have this warm glow coming in from the top. Just like so. Going back, grabbing some more. And I think that's a really nice effect. You can also kind of scrape off pigment if you'd like by just running your brush over it back and forth. So should you want to create some more clear areas or create just an entirely different effect, this is an option with the light rays. Here we have some yellow ones now and some blue ones, and it's really quite neat. But it's a very easy way of just changing the color in your painting, making it warmer, making it cooler. Here I'm adding it to the ground, and I think it looks absolutely gorgeous down here. Working my way around the elephant for the most part. There we go. Now let's continue though. I'm going to take a little bit of that yellow and significantly more of that burnt sienna. Now I'm using about a 2-to-1 ratio of yellow to burnt sienna. And I'm going to use this as a highlight for the elephant. We don't have to keep it gray, and it'll get reflected light. It'll have this warm light shining down on it, so it really shouldn't even be gray. So here, we just take that orange, a nice warm brown. It's kind of golden. Going to avoid the eye just so it remains white. And I'll also, of course, avoid the tusks for the most part. And I'll just move it about. There we are. We could have gone over the elephant with the gold that we had up there, but adding in a little bit of that brown, making it a little bit more red and warm, I think made it more interesting. And if you get it over the tusk, it's okay, because honestly it would get a little bit of that, but if you want to take it off again, remember, just use a lot of water and work that paint out of the area. Going to go in a couple of times, and you know what, I'll grab some more burnt sienna and make it even more of this nice rusty color. That way it stands out a little bit from the background. There we we are. Feel like it feels so much more natural now. We can also add hints of this warmer pigment to some of our foliage here. That'll be catching some additional light. Make that all a little bit more cohesive. And we can cool down other areas of the painting by taking some of our cerulean blue, adding a lot of water to it, and then working it into the sides of the painting, into the corners, into areas of the background that we don't feel are going to be receiving as much of that warm light. There we are. And work it into the shadows of the trees because they won't be getting warm light. And it's just a really easy way to add some extra color depth into your painting. There you see I added a lot of blue, which is quite nice up here, but I think it's a little extravagant down in this area. So here we're just going to scrape it off, and we can even use our hands, our fingers, a cloth, plenty of different options. I think that turned out quite well though. I'm looking at the foot here, and I noticed I just missed a little bit of that orange. So I'm applying that, doing a couple of layers. Once it dries a little bit, it's easier to go back in and add more color. There we go. And I think apply a little bit more blue to the edges. Just really like how this is turning out. Added quite a bit there. That's okay though. Here you can see I'm just blending it. Nice and easy. Now, I think I can also be very delicate and add just a hint of the blue into the shadows of the elephant. Give it some extra color depth. As so. There we are. Add a hint into the shadow of the ear. And this one too. You can also add a little into the shadow. Now, when we did this, while glazing doesn't affect value much, it does a little bit, especially with very bright values. So what we can do, we can take our medium-sized round-headed brush, make sure that it's nice and wet, grab a bit of titanium white, make it very watery, and then we can actually add to our highlights again, should we want to kind of brighten things. Now, it's semi-transparent, so we're still going to see through it to a point, which is why I'm able to use a pure titanium white. I generally don't advise using a pure white or black in your paintings, but when it's transparent, you can see color through it, so it isn't truly a pure white, right? The pigments on the canvas are still also a little bit wet, which are blending to a point with what I'm currently applying. Just making it a slightly more dramatic light in here. Quite nice though. There we go. Make the top a little bit brighter. That's where the light's coming from. There we are. And now I'm going to take a couple of steps back and just see how it's progressing and what changes I might want to make. After stepping back, I realized that I liked the light a lot, but I wanted it to be a little more subtle. So what you can do, you can take that same round-headed brush, make sure it's damp without any paint on it, and you can just go over that white again, move it about, and the more you move it, the more you'll thin it, the less opaque it will be, the less stark it will be. Here you can see it's looking more and more yellow as we progress because it's blending more and more with the lighter wash that we just applied with that gold. There we are. I think that's much better. It's just a hint more subtle. You can also go back in and paint foliage on top. Very simply, taking our smaller little flat-headed brush, take a little bit of yellow, a little bit of blue, hint of Mars black, a little more Mars black, and a hint of titanium white, of course, to give it a little bit of gray, as we know it needs. And just like this, we bring it right back into the foreground. Good. So from here, I really like it. Initially, I had some flowers in the foreground. We can add some really subtle ones with the smaller flat-headed brush, taking some of that cerulean blue, bit of titanium white. We'll grab a hint of Mars black as well, just because I don't want it to be too bright and stark. I don't want it to steal the attention of just about everything. And then we can throw in some nice little flowers here in the foreground. Just add a little bit more of a cool color into the painting again. The edges already have a fair bit of it, and this will complement that well. Can add hints of them into the background. I'm just doing 3 or 4 little taps, creating a couple of nice little petals, and keeping it simple. Then I'll create some smaller ones with just individual little taps. This way it'll look like they're at different depths. The ones with individual taps will look farther down. The ones with all of the petals will look higher up. And I'm just applying them until they feel natural in the painting. You can even go in and brighten a couple that are going to be receiving a little bit more light. Generally, those will be the higher up ones, the ones with more petals. There we are. Looks quite good. Oh, that's a nice little touch right there. We can even add other colors by taking our burnt sienna, hint of our titanium white. Maybe we can make a nice little berry or a set of them up here. You could also paint flowers in this color. I'm just doing little sets of berries, sets of 3s, 5s, generally odd numbers. And I'm working these closer into the center because it's a warmer pigment and I want it to be closer to those warmer areas of light. That way it just kind of blends in, it feels cohesive. We can of course incorporate a couple down here. I just don't want to do many. Using the corner of my brush, keeping it really subtle. There we go. We can even take a bit of this and add a little bit of highlight to the tops of the elephant, the areas that are really going to be receiving a lot of light. See how that really made it pop right there? It's a quick detail that can do a lot for a painting. Add a hint more on the leg. So really make him feel nice and warm. There we are. We'll add a slight highlight running down the trunk, just because it's in the foreground and I want to draw a little more attention to it. I'll do less of a highlight on this back leg because it's farther away, and while it may be nice and in the light, I don't want it to be too bright or too distracting. Now I'll take a little bit of our titanium white, mix it with a little bit of our yellow, and I'll create the middles for a couple of these flowers. Not all of them. Just a couple that I want to stand out, be tall and prominent. There. It's another nice little detail. After stepping back, I realized that a couple of the flowers on the right and left hand side are a little bit brighter than I want. I want a bit of a more subdued value. So I'm going to take some of my cerulean blue, mix it beside the pigment I initially used. That way I have a good reference. Take some Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. Mix that, and now we have a much more dark blue. So I'll go back and I'll just reapply this over some of the flowers and petals that I have on the outskirts. You know what, I think we could go even darker. So I'll take a bit more Mars black. And we'll just add some shadow to these petals. It's still blue, so if you still kind of get close and look at it, you'll see that there are these flowers. They're just significantly more subtle than they were initially. And that's not a bad thing. It's subtlety that's really going to bring your painting to the next level. There we go. Take another step back, see how that turned out. Kind of walk around the room. And you know what? There we have it. That is today's hour-long painting lesson. I'm sure it took more than an hour, but you know what? It was a lot of fun. We got to do another wildlife piece. These innately do take a little bit longer, but I'm glad we did it. So I hope you enjoyed. I'm really curious as to see what you'd like to see next. If you simply watched the video first and now you intend to go do the painting, remember that the traceable and the reference photo that I used quite a bit are up over on Patreon, and I really appreciate your time and you being here today. I post these hour-long lessons each and every Saturday, and it is still a pleasure to complete these. So thank you for joining me. And remember, if you are a patron, that I just added 4 new books, so there are 5 ebooks now currently up over on Patreon that you can get at the Alpine level, along with the 50 bonus lessons and all of the traceables and whatnot. But that is our painting today. It's kind of hard to turn off the camera and say goodbye to this one. I look at it, I feel like it's done, but I want to continue, you know? It's a good feeling to have. So anyways, I will see you later. I will see you next Saturday. I appreciate you. And above all, as always, stay creative.